Today we turn our attention to Charles Griswold's book, Forgiveness, a Philosophical Exploration. You may remember from last week, we finished up our discussion of Robert Enright's book, Forgiveness is a Choice. And Enright, as you'll remember, is a psychologist. And so he gave us a psychological approach to forgiveness. And so with Griswold, we turn to a philosophical approach. And as we'll see, it should become apparent, there's some significant differences between Enright's psychological approach and Griswold's philosophical approach. However, in this video today, I'm going to just try to give a summary of Griswold's approach. I'll leave it to class discussion where we can do some comparison and contrasting between Enright's psychological approach and Griswold's philosophical approach. My aim in looking at Griswold's book is rather limited. It's a big book. He does a lot of things in the book, but what I want to focus on is his central section where he deals with what he calls forgiveness at its best. Forgiveness at its best. This is the central part of his book, as I said, and it's where he does his kind of constructive, philosophical look at forgiveness. But as I said, in the book he does a whole lot more. So what I want to do is give some brief preliminary remarks so we can understand what Griswold's up to when he's talking about forgiveness at its best. So a brief overview. Griswold's a philosopher, so he has to look at the philosophical background to this, both ancient and modern, right? What do the ancients like Plato and Aristotle have to say about forgiveness? What do modern folks like Hume and Nietzsche have to say about forgiveness? I think significantly, though, in this survey of the philosophical approaches to forgiveness, Griswold spends a fair amount of time with Bishop Butler's approach, and as we saw way back in the beginning, Butler's sermons on forgiveness are really kind of the foundation and the beginning of the modern discussion of forgiveness. And Griswold actually is not only spends a lot of time with Butler, he actually agrees with Butler on a whole lot. We'll see he goes on and differs from Butler, but he builds on Butler. So in a certain sense, Griswold's approach could be considered Butlerian, if that's a word. He's doing a philosophical approach, so he's offering a secular approach. It's not a religious approach, but I do think it's significant that he builds on Bishop Butler's approach. After he sort of gives the survey of ancient and modern approaches to forgiveness, then comes his central section on forgiveness at its best. That's where I'll come back to that and spend the bulk of my time on that. But then, interestingly, after forgiveness at its best, and I think tellingly, he has a section that he calls imperfect forgiveness, right? You got forgiveness at its best, and then he looks at imperfect forgiveness. And under imperfect forgiveness, he deals with things like unilateral forgiveness. That is, forgiveness when I might forgive someone who hasn't been repentant or asked for forgiveness or made an apology, or forgiveness of the dead, or self-forgiveness. So the first thing to say is that he's not saying these things are illegitimate. They may be legitimate, but they aren't forgiveness at its best. They are somehow imperfect. Okay, so he's making a distinction between forgiveness at its best and imperfect forms. I think it's important to see that he is pulling apart different types of forgiveness that some people lump together. Enright put all these things together, right? He talked about forgiveness when somebody makes an apology, or when someone doesn't make an apology, or when someone's dead. He's kind of putting it all together. Also, the thing to note is for some people, unilateral forgiveness becomes the paradigm case of forgiveness. That becomes the model for what perfect forgiveness is. That is, forgiveness without any conditions. As we'll see, Griswold disagrees. Griswold thinks forgiveness at its best actually has a whole lot of conditions. We see there's a real difference between Griswold and Enright and between Griswold and others on that. So forgiveness at its best is followed by this section about imperfect forgiveness and the examples of those types of forgiveness. Then the book ends with a fairly long discussion of political forgiveness. But I should put forgiveness in quotes because basically his argument boils down to that forgiveness should not be talked about in the political sphere. It just sort of muddies the waters. Conceptually, it's a confusion. Philosophically, it's a category mistake. So forgiveness at its best, as we'll see, is this interpersonal relationship. He wants to kind of say that's where we should talk about it. In the political sphere, he'd rather talk about apology, political apology, maybe pardon, if that's appropriate, reparations, maybe even some kinds of reconciliation in the political sphere. But forgiveness, no, he doesn't really think it's appropriate there. So that's where he ends his book, saying, because there's a large discussion about political forgiveness, how it's done, what it means, and those kinds of things. And I think he just wants to say, let's not even talk about forgiveness there. Let's talk about apology or other things. So that's the big framework. But what I'm going to focus on is within that, survey of the ancient literature, some imperfect forms and political forgiveness or not. I want to talk about that paradigm case, that ideal for forgiveness that he talks about as forgiveness at its best. So what is forgiveness at its best? Well, the first thing to say is that for Griswold, forgiveness is a virtue. And a virtue is a praiseworthy or excellent way of being responsive to the world, given the type of creatures that we are, right? So it's an excellent character trait of an admirable person. For example, we might say of someone that they are magnanimous, or that they are courageous, or that they are benevolent, or we might say that they are forgiving, right? So forgiveness is a virtue. It is an excellence of character. So in one sense, forgiveness as a virtue is about the person, the type of person someone is. But forgiveness as a virtue also contributes to the good or the common good of humanity, right? That is to say, having a society in which people exercise the virtue of forgiveness is better than a society in which this is not the case, right? Think of a society that somehow prized or admired revenge rather than forgiveness, right? So forgiveness contributes to a good society as well as a good character of a person. And so forgiveness as a virtue helps us as people to lead a good life. Now, forgiveness understood as a virtue remains a choice. However, since for Griswold, forgiveness is a praiseworthy moral virtue, there is more of an emphasis on saying that forgiveness is something that one ought to do under the right circumstances. That is to say, if all the conditions that Griswold spells out are met, then he is saying that forgiveness ought to take place. It's not only appropriate, but it ought to take place. And that's also to say, if it doesn't take place under these conditions, the person is blameworthy. So we see for Griswold, while forgiveness remains a choice, he is more directive, let's say, than Enright, because as a virtue, given the right conditions, forgiveness is something that ought to be done because it's praiseworthy. And if it's not done under those conditions, the person is blameworthy. So, forgiveness is a virtue. So what then is this virtue of forgiveness? Griswold gives us three things. So first, forgiveness is the forswearing of revenge. The forswearing of revenge. Griswold thinks this is just obvious, right? He says it would be incomprehensible to say that person X has forgiven person Y if person X is intent on taking revenge on person Y. It just makes no sense to say you put those two things together. So forgiveness is the forswearing of revenge. However, Griswold notes that the forswearing of revenge is compatible with, say, person X endorsing whatever, impartial judicial punishment is allotted to person Y by a court of law, for example, right? So forgiveness does not exempt the wrongdoer from impartially administered justice. So the second thing that forgiveness is forgiveness is the moderating of resentment. Forgiveness is the moderating of resentment. So there's lots of different types of anger that we've talked about before, so I'll just narrow in. So for Griswold, resentment is the moral anger one feels at being unjustly treated. And for Griswold, like Butler, in and of itself, resentment can be an appropriate and natural response to being morally harmed. It says that the wrong behavior was in fact wrong. It says that I'm a human being of dignity and worth, and this should not have been done to me. It can also spur one on to take steps to ensure that no further injustice is done to others. So, resentment in and of itself can be an appropriate response, at least at one level. It becomes problematic when it gets out of control, right? Seething and stoking resentment can lead us to try to do harm to the wrongdoer, take revenge on the wrongdoer, and also ends up harming our own moral character, right? So a second aspect or second part of what forgiveness is this moderating of our resentment so that it is proportionate to the harm that was done to us. The third part of forgiveness is the commitment to let go of any lingering resentment. Here, Griswold goes further than Butler, right? First, you got to moderate resentment, but he thinks that somehow there's an intuition that full forgiveness must mean at some point getting rid of any lingering resentment for the harm that is done to us. So maybe at first we moderate our resentment so it's right-sized in relationship to the harm, but if we are going to forgive, according to Griswold, we also commit ourselves, maybe we're not there yet, but we commit ourselves to, at some point, letting go of any lingering or remaining resentment. So there's these three things. It's the forswearing of revenge, the moderating of resentment, and a commitment that at some point we will let go of any lingering resentment. So the next section is about the conditions the wrongdoer must meet for it to be appropriate for the injured party to offer forgiveness. Notice Griswold is saying forgiveness at its best comes with a lot of conditions. 6 conditions to be precise. I think we have already noticed that some people want to talk about forgiveness as unconditional. Clearly, Griswold does not agree. Forgiveness at its best has conditions. So I just want to go through these 6 in order and rather briefly. So first, the wrongdoer must acknowledge that they are in fact responsible for their actions, right? A failure to take responsibility for their wrongdoing is either a denial of the truth that they did harm or an avoidance of the truth that they did harm. It adds a kind of insult to injury. And if the injured party offered forgiveness without this acknowledgement that this person was responsible, Griswold thinks that this would be a case of condoning behavior rather than forgiveness. So the first thing that Griswold says is that the wrongdoer must acknowledge that they are responsible for their action. Second, the wrongdoer must also repudiate their past deeds, right? Not only, did they do that, those deeds are wrong, and they have to say, and I would not do that again. So they have to repudiate those past deeds, right? Third, the wrongdoer must experience regret and also express regret to the injured person, right? It's not enough that the wrongdoer simply feels regret, but they must communicate this to the injured party, right? So for Griswold, forgiveness is part of this communicative actions between wrongdoer and injured party. And so it's not just sort of, oh, I feel really bad. I have to communicate that I regret my wrongdoing, okay? So the fourth condition that the wrongdoer must meet is they have to commit to becoming the sort of person who does not inflict injury, right? So commitment must be shown through deeds as well as words, right? So for the repudiation of the past actions to be credible, well, the wrongdoer also has to show that they are amending their ways, that they are changing their ways, okay? So they have to commit to becoming the sort of person who doesn't do that anymore, okay? Fifth condition is the wrongdoer must show that he or she understands from the perspective of the injured party the damage that they have done, right? So here the wrongdoer must learn to sympathize with the victim by trying to put themselves in their place and see the damage that is done from their perspective, right? So it entails listening to the victim's account and grasping it with compassion, right? I've got to try to say it. I got to try to understand as best I can the harm that is done. And I got to hear what the victim has to say. And I have to repeat it back in a way in which the victim will say, yeah, you're getting there. You got it, right? So to go through this process of forgiveness, a wrongdoer has to try to show that they do understand the harm, and what that meant for the injured party. So that's the fifth condition. And the sixth condition is they should offer an account of how they came to do wrong, how they are more than their past actions, and how they are taking steps to change their behavior. So they need to offer a narrative account as a way to try to make themselves intelligible to the person who has been injured. It's trying to put the wrongdoing and the person who did the wrongdoing in a context. Because Griswold says the person who has been injured, the person who has been harmed, has some questions, legitimate questions. Who is this person? How could such a person do this to me? And if I'm going to forgive this person, how is this person showing that they are no longer the type of person who will do this injury again? So it's a communicative act, and the wrongdoer must offer an account. The injured party deserves that. They ought to hear this. Tell me, how did this happen? How are you more than your past actions? And how are you now taking steps to change your behavior? So that's the sixth and final condition that the wrongdoer must meet. So Griswold finishes up his description of forgiveness at its best with some conditions that must happen for the injured party. Right? We talked about the 6 conditions that the wrongdoer must meet, and now there are 3 conditions that must be met by the injured party for forgiveness to take place. So first, the injured party must re-envision the wrongdoer, right? So this is the condition that where the injured party sees the wrongdoer in a new light, right? We must somehow distinguish between the part of the person who did wrong and the total person, right? We must come to see them not as simply moral monsters, right? Here, it's probably helpful to remember that exercise that Enright had, where we try to, see the person, their childhood, their adolescence, what was going on in their life at the time. They're part of the human community. So we re-envision the person, the wrongdoer, in this larger framework or this larger narrative. So that's the first condition. The second condition for the injured party is they must reframe their view or their understanding of themselves, right? So here we must drop our assumptions of decisive moral superiority, says Griswold, right? We have to recognize our common humanity, right? We recognize our frailty as human beings. We recognize the times that we have done wrong, the times that we have needed forgiveness, right? So there's this reframing that takes place in terms of the injured party sees the wrongdoer in a new light. Well, the injured party needs to also reframe how they understand themselves. The wrongdoer is not a moral monster, and I am not a moral paragon or perfect. I also have my flaws as well. And the third condition for the injured party to meet is that they must declare verbally, or maybe it could be written, but you have to declare, you have to communicate that you forgive the wrongdoer, right? The wrongdoer who met these 6 conditions has expressed contrition, which constitutes a request for forgiveness. And for forgiveness to be complete, at least at its best, according to Griswold, there must be a communicative act in response. And so the injured party should address the wrongdoer and declare that forgiveness is granted. Griswold says if you can't say it, maybe you really haven't forgiven this person. But it's more than that. It's because forgiveness for Griswold is this communicative interaction between wrongdoer and injured party, and when the conditions are in place, somehow it would be incomplete if the injured party did not declare that they, in fact, forgive the person who did them wrong. So, forgiveness at its best for Griswold happens when all these conditions are met by both the wrongdoer and the injured party, right? And so under these conditions, under these circumstances, Griswold says forgiveness is not only appropriate, it is praiseworthy, right? It is a virtue. It is an excellence of character. It's good for the person's happiness, for the flourishing of a person, for a life well lived, and it also contributes to the good of society. So that is a brief summary of Griswold's picture or description of what forgiveness at its best looks like.